the rest of the time with. I've not done this before on this book tour, but you are family, and I want you to know this is the one story that I couldn't write. And you know me well enough, many of you, to know that I've written some hard stories. My mother and grandmother's deaths, my brother's death by suicide, what's happening on the planet, what's happening to our American West. During the pandemic, 8 million acres were on fire. You know it well here in the greater Yellowstone in Montana. But this was the story that I could not write. And yet I knew that I had to, and I also knew that it was that I couldn't leave the divinity school until I faced what happened. I also want to tell you this story because I think these are hard times, and it's easy to be brought to our knees. I know I am brought to my knees more than I care to even say, not just in prayer but in despair. But what I've come to learn is that in those moments when I think my imagination is too small, I know that imaginations shared create collaboration, and in collaboration we find community, and in community anything is possible. I've also learned that when things are the toughest, we're in the middle of the story, and we can't see yet where we're going. So this is the story that I want to share, and it's the through line through the Glorians. There's a narrative that runs in the Glorians, the pandemic, returning back to the divinity school, and then returning home in flash floods and what's going on in southern Utah and the Colorado Plateau. And then again, the epilogue. But this is the through line. As many of you know, and this is personal, Brooke and I, as a matter of protest, bought oil and gas leases in 2016. Tim DeChristopher had done that 8 years earlier as an act of civil disobedience. He served 2 years in a federal prison, never allowed to even tell his story in court. Brooke and I found ourselves in a moment where this was possible. We'd had a class looking at the University of Utah at all the different counties that were affected by fossil fuel industry. I found myself inside as an introvert. It was the shortest line, and there I was with all the oil and gas executives bidding. I heard how they were talking about the lands I knew by name, the lands near where we lived. It was misogynist, it was sexist, it was racist, it was vile. And Brooke was on the outside with other protesters, and we both, when we came back together, had the same impulse. I didn't want to purchase leases in the auction itself because they would say that we had robbed them from the barons themselves. So we knew that there's a remnant sale afterwards where you can purchase oil and gas leases for half price. In this case, it was $1.50 per acre. I'm giving you this background because this is why I was at the Divinity School. Our leases were denied due to due process. We sued the federal government, the Department of Interior. It sat before the Board of Appeals for 6 years, and then they too denied them. But with great people like Tracy Manning, a rule was created, and conservation buyers are allowed. We'll see how long. That's not an answer to a solution, but it did push it forward so that one day maybe we can change the 1920 Minerals Leasing Act. This is all to say I was fired. If they had just said you crossed the line, Terry, I would have accepted that. But they didn't. They said I was bad at paperwork, which may have been true too, but that wasn't the reason I was gone. And I grieved. It was my only ambition in life was to teach at the University of Utah my own people. And my own, we came to Montana, the Centennial Valley, the West. But my soul had other ideas, I guess. Anyway, I was evicted from the tribe. I grieved. I stayed home. I really thought through that you can't write about women, women's rights, about the earth, about the patriarchy without consequences. And I was facing those consequences. I got a call from the Divinity School. They said, we'd love to have you come. this is what our students are wanting to learn about with climate and spirituality. And when I came, I met him, I said yes. And he said, what question are you bringing to us? And what I said was, it wasn't planned, but he just asked cold. I said, I want to explore what the spiritual implications of climate change might be. And that's really been the guiding presence. That was in 2017. The next year, I was invited back, and let me back up. I'm not telling this perfectly, so thank you for bearing with me. When I went, there was a professor who was a transcendentalist who focused on Thoreau and Emerson, and he said, I want you to meet the divinity tree. And it was this extraordinary 200-year-old red oak that had been there probably when Emerson was there, when Emerson gave that great speech. Some people said it was even older than 200 years. You will remember that Emerson in July of 1838 was asked by 6 graduating divinity school students to come speak to them for graduation. It was a small chapel, now known as the Emerson Chapel, and it was filled with skeptical priests and ministers. He opened this speech with an homage to nature and used the word refulgent, the refulgent spring. And then as he went further, at the very end, he looked at these students and said, your God is too small. He was banned from Harvard for 30 years. This was the tree. That tree became my companion. I was homesick. Brooke didn't come often. And for good reasons, my office looked out over this divinity tree. It was a whole community: squirrels, Cooper's hawks, redtails, creepers, nuthatches, blue jays. You can see it. It was where the children came for lunch. It was where lovers came and proposed to each other. It was where people read. It was center. It was the interfaith space at the Divinity School. And then suddenly we heard that there was a plan, that a $60 million gift had been given to refurbish and make the Divinity School more sustainable. It was $1 million to heat the Divinity School with oil. They showed the plan in the foyer. There was no divinity tree in the plan. And the students' first question when they had the public hearing was, where is the divinity tree? And they said, there's no room. And when they were asked, what is that space going to be used for? The administration said, for an interfaith space. And a very contentious 6 months followed. People came to hearings dressed like trees. African American students, were protesting, saying to the students who were in favor of saving the tree, if you cared as much about human beings, black and brown people, then we wouldn't have the problems we have. The administration was checking the backgrounds of the students who were protesting, and the students who were protesting were making it very difficult for the administration. That's in a nutshell. And then the decision was made. The dean, whom I actually love, said, and in a private moment, he said, Terry, if I wasn't dean, I would be on your side with the students and other faculty members. He said, we have to go forward. We've planted 123 trees before you all even came. This is about climate. It was complicated, right? But the students then said, if you are going to kill the tree, then what we ask is that we can mourn the tree together. And then we found out that the killing of the tree was going to be during spring break. And there was another protest, and they finally obliged. During this time, there was scaffolding going up, there was crime tape around the tree. They were saying it was going to hurt someone. Students couldn't even have access to the tree. Some were arrested. Every religious tradition honored that tree, whether it was Hindu, whether it was Muslim, whether it was Jewish. There were Christmas lights. There were Tibetan prayer flags. It was a beloved tree. And then the wake came. And it was Janet Gyatso, who's a Tibetan scholar. She's probably this tall. She stood before this immense tree, and on behalf of the Harvard Divinity School, the administration, she apologized to the tree and said Tibetan prayers. There were arias sung. Some of the students gathered acorns and made communion wafers. You understand the picture. And then it was slated to be killed the next day. Prior to that, Robin Wall Kimmerer and came, put her hand on the tree and said, "This is murder. We must name it." I didn't have the courage to say that. That night, I got locked out of God's Motel, where Brooke and I were living. It was probably 1:30 in the morning. It was cold, but I had enough clothes on, warm clothes, etc. There was no police that I could call to have open it for me, and I just thought, the tree has 7 more hours. I can sleep with the tree. So I went over. I slept with the tree. I put my head on the tree's roots, put my hand on the trunk, and listened. And what, as a writer, we know our vocabulary, right? I see Betsy. We know what words we use in our vocabulary. What came into my mind were not my words, and I believe they were the trees. And as my community, what I heard was, my absence will be my presence. And then the sun rose, the machines came, the crime tape was put around so no students could be near, and we watched limb by limb by limb be cut, starting with the crown. And it took 4.5 hours to destroy what it took 250 years to create. The side story of this is, this was just shortly after my brother had taken his life. He had hung himself. And I think the thing that was the haunting for me was who took that noose off my brother's neck when they found him on his knees. And my brother and I were very close, and he had told me months before, I have the rope. I have to believe my suffering will be met with compassion. And he was not a believer in God. These are all the backstories. So every time one of the nooses was placed on that branch and cut and carried by the crane over that Gothic facade and brought down, there was one man with such reverence who received that branch and carefully, lovingly took off that noose and then placed the branches on the ground. In that moment, that tree not only became family, but that tree became every single tree that has been cut. We can't know what a genocide is. We can't know what a clear cut really is, but we can know one tree. And I think each of us in our own life can think about that one tree. Maybe it was in your grandparents' house. Maybe it was in the house where you grew up. Maybe it's a particular tree in the greater Yellowstone. We all witness that. And that act of bearing witness is not passive. That act of bearing witness has consequence, consciousness, and care. Today, to bear witness is a crime. We saw that in Minneapolis. That tree holds these stories for me. They cut the trunk in, I think, 8 sections, is that big? Huge. And put crime tape around that. And with that, the students said, no, you got it right, this is a crime, but we are staying with the body of this tree. And they touched their hands on those parts and said prayers. This is a divinity school. And then there was a gentleman who, with the materials, the cranes, etc., put all of those body parts into the back of a truck, and they left. And 30 minutes later, there was no evidence that tree was ever there, except for the scar of the trunk of the stump. 30 minutes later, a new group of students came for orientation for the Divinity School. 5 years later, I'm just minding my own business, coming out of the building, and I'm checking my time. I'll make this quick. I get a call. Those of you who know me know I don't answer the phone. But it was John Monks, and I thought, what a weird name. It must be a prank. So I picked it up and said, hello. He said, is Terry Tempest Williams there? And I said, I'm Terry. And he said, my name is John Monks, and I have the body of the Divinity Tree. And I thought, I said, excuse me? And he said, I have the body of the Divinity Tree. And I said, what are you talking about? And he said, about 5 years ago, I woke up and there were these huge parts of this red oak with a note that said, this is the body of the Divinity Tree. Please turn it into something beautiful. And as I looked at these huge pieces of a trunk, I saw spray painted in green, good luck humans, you're going to need it. And I thought, there's a story here. Well, he had just created a new business where he was taking heirloom trees that people loved in the neighborhood, etc., and then they would bring them to him, and he would then create tables, furniture, chairs, etc., as an homage, not a replacement, but as a memory.